I've been gone on vacation for a couple of weeks. I had a friend who was over here helping me water the garden, but when I came back home, I found it was full of weeds. That's usual when we haven't been taking care of things, that the weeds will show up. So today's video, I would like to speak about weeds. First off, I think we should try to define what is a weed. I think the most appropriate definition I've ever heard was a weed is a plant out of place. That works pretty good. I actually like that one pretty well. But then again, sometimes we have weeds in the garden that we don't consider to be out of place. I mean, when I have potatoes come up sometimes in the right areas, that's fine. Tomatoes around the garden. I have weeds out here that I actually plant in my own garden, in a manner of speaking. And so I have intended weeds, unintended weeds. Some weeds are edible, okay? But in general, I'd say that we want to try to control weeds before they seed, but prior to seeding, weeds are actually desirable. If you have weeds in your garden, it's a pretty good possibility the weeds are telling you certain things about your land, the practices that you imply. The weeds are telling you a story. When you go into the garden, you walk around, you see weeds growing. Most of the time, if you're astute, you can tell an awful lot about the history of what's happened there and the practices that the person engages in the garden and so on. Weeds are quite telling. You can't hide behind your weeds. Generally, somebody who could read a weed will be able to tell you your whole life history in the garden. They say an awful lot. So, let's go into the garden and have a look at my weeds. First off, I've got the one over here that was really troubling me when I came home. I walked out into the corn and I looked around and I said, oh my goodness, I have crabgrass everywhere. And so this is crabgrass right here, flat to the ground. Crabgrass is a free-seeding annual warm season grass. I happen to have it in my garden in abundance because recently I tilled this area. Tillage often creates weed problems. When you're not tilling much, you don't usually have as many weeds in the garden. I had ancient crabgrass seeds that were from years and years ago buried in this area when the yard was a wasteland disaster before we acquired it. And because I wanted to get rid of the clover I had planted, which my clover was an intended weed, I took my tiller and I tilled all the clover down and killed it. Well, when I did that, I stirred up crabgrass seed that had been buried underneath for years, brought it to the top, and now it's coming up all over the place. I got it over here, all between the sweet corn, all around the tomatoes. So that was the first one I noticed, and I have to do something about it. Alrighty, so the most basic thing we do when we have weeds is we cultivate them. And we don't want to cultivate deeply, okay? We want to make a shallow cultivation just deep enough that we pass right under the roots of the weed that we're working with, so that we're cutting it right off, right there. See? If you dig deeper than you need to, you're going to stir up more weed seeds again, and so that's not desirable. We want to make shallow cultivation. Right now I'm passing barely an inch into the soil, but I'm cutting the roots of the crabgrass. The tool that I'm using here is called a strap hoe. It's sometimes also known as a hula hoe because the hula action you do with your hips while you're running this thing. Okay, well, that didn't take too long. A little bit of help from the hoe over here. I took care of all the crabgrass that was over here in my corn and my tomatoes. See here that all we really need to do to kill this is to cut it off just about right there. It comes right out. And as long as we catch this stuff before it starts to seed, this is actually good green manure. Weeds are good for the soil. How's that? Okay. They're good for the garden. They're also telling you you probably don't have any cover crops out there. You might be short of mulch. It tells you a whole lot of things about the garden. This one here tells me definitely that years ago this place was all dry and just a waste area. And so lots and lots of crabgrass accumulated in the yard. And so it also tells me that I dug too deep with my tiller while killing the clover, because I brought this up. It had been gone from the top. I don't cultivate very deep. Okay, so we took care of that one. But while I was out here, I spotted a bunch of other weeds that I preserved. Let me show you. While I was hoeing around through the tomatoes over here, I spotted this little guy. That one right there, that's parsley. Here's another one. And there's a whole bunch more of them right over there. And so those are weeds. I had parsley out here last year, and the parsley went to seed, but it's given me some volunteers. And they're, you know, kind of out of place, and I definitely didn't plant them, but that's the kind of weeds I like to see, because I love parsley, and I haven't got enough but planted this year anyway. So nature having taken care of me, I am very happy that I have parsley between my tomatoes and corn here. And so there's a weed that we left in place. Right here's another weed right between two corn stalks. I went ahead and I just left it be. That's a cherry tomato. I forgot to plant cherry tomato seeds this year, so I guess that's good news, huh? There's one at least. Right next to it over here, there's another weed. Well, that one's a potato. They come up in my garden all the time. I'll leave them there. We'll get something off of them. And so there's a weed. That's a good weed. It's a weed we can eat. Right over here is a weed. This one's called zucchini. Apparently I had a zucchini plant here. Must have let one of the fruit get way too ripe and just let it rot there in spot. And so a plant came up for us. So we have a free zucchini, which again is a weed. Not bad, right? Right over here you'll see these yellowish stems. Well, these were sunflowers. Right there. Well, I didn't plant these. These were up to the birds. And so that was good. But right behind it, right here, this is dill. And I never noticed it because it was in a bed of carrots. And the two are related and look similar. So I didn't even spot it till just now when it started to stand up. And dill, of course, is a really delicious thing to have around. Love it in my salads, good with cucumbers, and so on. So it's staying. I have more dill in the greenhouse in a 6-pack. This one's way further along. And again, I didn't plant it. It was a weed. It showed up on its own. Right here we have weeds that I did plant. This is right along my path here. And I took most of the clover out of the garden this year because I'm afraid it was going to suck up extra water that I needed for my crops since we're in a drought. But I left a little bit right along my trail because it kind of holds the dirt off the trail. And so here is a weed that I actually planted. I can see that it's getting into my beans a bit over there, and I'm going to have to do some trimming. So instead of hoeing the clover out, I'm going to go through the clover with a pair of shears, and I'm going to cut it all back. Right here I've got some delicious looking zucchini, but it's getting overrun with alfalfa. Alfalfa there, alfalfa here. Alfalfa everywhere. This alfalfa, again, was a weed that I planted. It's there to hold the soil, and what I'll do about it, again, is just going to go right in there with a pair of shears, trim that stuff down, throw it on the ground as mulch to keep the moisture in. So, now you can see where I've gone through with a pair of clippers over the clover, and I have cut everything back and tossed it under my Italian beans here. Looks like I got some serious bean picking to do. It's time. We got Italian string beans. Okay, time to pick those. And over here, then, where the zucchini was getting overrun with alfalfa, I went ahead and I cut back all the alfalfa and I laid it over here underneath the plants as a mulch on the soil. So the next thing to say about weeds in the garden is mulch. Right here you can see that I have impervious woven weed block laying down on my garden row where I walk all the time. And that doesn't get much for weeds if I keep the dirt off of it. Yet, right next to it there's some wild oats coming up. There's some wild oats coming up right here. And so just outside the mulch, we find weeds. Right here in my path where I have clover growing, I can see a little bit of crabgrass that got in there, but by and large, where we have a good plant growth, we have very few weeds. So if the soil is covered well with plants, weeds are at a minimum. Right over here, these Santa Barbara daisies are a good example of what can happen when you put down a plant that successfully covers the ground. It eliminates most of the weeds. And there are the mulches that most of you know, the organic mulches. Right here I have some pepper plants that are growing out of a big pile of compost. Now I do have weeds in here, but the vast majority of them actually are potatoes right here, because potatoes will come up through mulch. Now I don't want them in my pepper patch, so I'm going to take these potatoes out. Right there is a little offending spud on the bottom, got left in the garden. So I'm going to have to hand weed those. Got quite a few of them actually. They also can carry the diseases that peppers can get. Potatoes and tomatoes and peppers and eggplants are all closely related, and it's not a good idea to be growing them together. I actually didn't have potatoes growing in this spot last year. As I said, they are weeds in my garden. So, whereas weeds like potatoes will come up through a mulch, over here you can see I have a mulch, and there's tomato plants. We got some pepper plants in the middle there, and then a whole bunch of cabbages down here on this end. And right in the rows, the only weed I see is one potato between the peppers over there. Otherwise, I move over a few inches into the walk row where there was no mulch. The walk row is completely covered in crabgrass seedlings and a few other things too. I get more than just crabgrass there, but see all that? Close up on the crabgrass. So you can see right there, I mean, it's just so clear. Weeds in the row where there was no mulch, no weeds where the mulch was put down. So aside from holding in moisture and enriching soil, another excellent reason for having plenty of mulch in the garden is it will help prevent weeds. So there's the short story on weeds in the garden. Number one, weeds tell you a lot about the gardener. Two, weeds are good for the garden. Nothing wrong with weeds as long as you don't let them seed. Okay, so don't let the weeds get started out there so that they start making more and more of themselves. You won't have to worry about weed seed. Plenty of it will come. Okay. Number three, plant your own weeds. Clover's a great weed. Alfalfa's a really good weed. Both of them fix nitrogen, good for the garden, draw in honeybees. The pollinators need more food to be healthy today. Some weeds like parsley, cilantro, tomato plant weeds, maybe potato weeds, and a variety of different garden vegetables that can become weedy. I even get pepper plant weeds. So, you know, cultivate certain plants that become weedy in the garden because you like to eat them or because they have purposes. But basically, a weed, if it's really a weed, is a plant out of place, and maybe a plant that has a weedy habit. A plant that will drop seeds and propagate more readily than you would want it to. So the weeds also will tell you, again, like I said, about the gardener. And if the gardener doesn't use mulch, well, the gardener's got all kinds of weeds. Places where you're going to be walking all the time, never planting anything, consider an impervious mulch that's permanent, like the weed block or some other type of material. Out in the vegetable garden and around the fruit trees, try compost, you know, try prunings from the boxwood hedges and all that sort of thing. Organic mulches, those are really nice, especially the ones like compost that you can work them right back down in the soil when you're all done for the year. And also, it will tell you whether the gardener cultivates or not. Those of us who don't cultivate very much, and especially don't cultivate deep, don't have a lot of weeds. The deeper you stir that dirt up, the worse the weed problem is going to become. So if you tend to leave the soil alone most of the time, your weed problems diminish dramatically. Anyway, with weeds, it's also timing. If you want to get rid of a weed, A, catch it when it's small. B, catch it before it seeds. C, catch it on a fire day, a day when you have a wind blowing, a day when the sun is out, a day at least when it's quite warm and there's a dehydrating factor going on. If you go out and weed in the middle of a rainstorm, there's a pretty good chance most of the weeds are going to go right back into the ground again. But if you weed in the morning and you get a bright, hot, sunny day, by afternoon, the weeds will be cooked into tinder and they won't be able to resprout again. So you don't really have to pick them all up. I generally leave the weeds lay right there. So the timing of your weeding is also really important. Don't pick one of those water sign days in the garden. Pick a day that the Farmer's Almanac says is a fire sign day. That's real good for killing weeds. Anyway, enjoy the garden this summer. I hope the weeds don't get too thick. If they do, try eating them or composting them. Happy gardening. Thanks for watching.